So why does civilizational collapse always feel like, an ambush?
Well, sudden systemic failure might simply be a cognitive illusion.
Right, because we always kind of expect some dramatic, blazing finale.
We do, but we may just be looking at the wrong environmental indicators entirely.
I mean, today we are diving into sources covering civilization analysis.
And these materials function more like a structural observation device for society.
Yeah, they definitely don't read like your standard daily news or history book.
They do not provide fixed conclusions. They just offer a log of structural pressure.
So the goal is basically to shift your entire cognitive perception, right?
Yes, we might need to stop waiting for unpredictable events to actually happen.
Instead, we should ask where we currently sit inside a predictable process.
Exactly. We tend to focus strictly on distinct, visible happenings in the world.
Right, like waking up to a sudden massive financial market crash.
Humans are fundamentally wired to observe only those types of clear events.
Or, a total halt in global supply chains happening overnight.
But focusing purely on discrete events creates a massive, dangerous cognition gap.
Wait, a gap between what we see and what is actually happening mechanically.
Precisely. There is a fundamental mismatch with the hidden reality of the structure.
It is like walking through the woods and only hearing the branch snap.
And we completely miss the long period of slow structural bending beforehand.
Right, because the actual bending of the wood happens in total silence.
Yes. What we observe as stability is actually hidden pressure continuously building up.
So the system looks completely fine on the outside, basically.
But the internal tension underneath may be growing completely unnoticed by everyone.
Just because we are only ever anxiously listening for that loud snap.
We might need to stop waiting for the break and watch the strain.
So what is the actual mechanical process causing that invisible bending?
Civilization might simply move through a slow, continuous accumulation of pressure.
Rather than just jumping from one random spontaneous event to another.
Correct. The sources describe it as a highly predictable mechanical progression.
And it apparently starts at the absolute lowest operational level of the system.
It begins where weak, isolated individual signals start to safely interact.
But individual signals usually seem totally harmless on their own, right?
They may appear harmless, but their continuous interaction generates heavy structural force.
Like a delayed shipment here or a minor bank issue over there.
Yes, when thousands of tiny anomalies quietly accumulate, they form a gradient.
A gradient. How should we actually visualize that specific term here?
A gradient represents an invisible structural tension that is actively building up.
Like a massive concrete dam holding back a giant reservoir of water.
Exactly. The dam itself represents the perceived stability of our current civilization.
While the gradient is that rising water pressure pushing against the wall?
It is a state of deep imbalance pushing the system away from equilibrium.
Okay, so back to that tree branch analogy from earlier.
The gradient would be the microscopic tension forming between the actual wood fibers.
Right, where one side is actively stretching and the other side is compressing.
And to anyone just casually looking at the tree, it appears completely fine.
The actual structural danger is just totally invisible to our naked eyes.
But this constant accumulation of internal pressure eventually leads to structural stress.
So the foundational architecture actually begins to warp under all that invisible weight.
Yes, the system might actively try to compensate to hide that growing stress.
But eventually, a critical threshold just has to be definitively crossed, right?
There is a point where the framework simply cannot maintain its operational state.
A moment where the wood literally cannot stretch another single millimeter.
That specific moment of criticality results in a sudden, violent phase shift.
Oh, the phase shift. That is the loud snap we hear.
That is when the underlying reality abruptly becomes a highly visible public event.
It is the breaking headline we see flashing on the morning news.
And because we only perceive that dramatic transition, we assume it was sudden.
We completely missed the silent gradient that was forming long beforehand.
We did. And this dynamic brings up a dangerous point regarding systemic irreversibility.
Yeah, at what exact moment does bouncing back suddenly become completely impossible?
The text notes that as structural stress increases, overall system resilience strongly decreases.
But wait, shouldn't the warning signs be flashing brightest right before the actual crash?
It might seem that way, but our fundamental ability to observe deterioration decreases.
Wait, why would our ability to see it go down at the peak?
Highly stressed systems often rigidify completely before they ultimately fail.
So they literally use all their remaining energy just to look normal.
Yes, They consume their buffer capacity to maintain the outward appearance of stability.
That is genuinely terrifying. Perfect outward stability might actually be a massive red flag,
The ultimate point of no return might be an incredibly subtle, hidden moment,
like a clear glass window right before it shatters into 1,000 pieces.
which is exactly why we must look at the specific functional layers of civilization.
The sources identify 4 layers, right? Resources, infrastructure, capital, and cognition.
Yes, systemic stress accumulates very differently within each of those distinct spaces.
Let's look at the physical infrastructure layer for just a second.
A hidden gradient might be steadily forming inside the concrete pillars of bridges,
Microscopic rust quietly eating away at the rebar while you safely drive over it.
or in the resources layer, aquifers might be quietly depleting deep underground.
Then you have the massive pressure building purely in the financial capital layer.
Millions of seemingly harmless mortgage defaults quietly interacting entirely in the background.
Creating invisible tension while everyone on Wall Street thinks everything is perfectly stable.
That 2008 crash is a pristine example of a capital layer phase shift.
But what about the mass human cognition layer? Because that one is fascinating.
It is. Pure cognitive overload might actually trigger the final phase shift very early.
Just the sheer speed of modern society completely overwhelming our ability to process reality.
If that cognitive layer crosses its threshold, society loses its capacity to respond.
So we literally cannot manage the stress in the other 3 layers anymore.
The physical infrastructure might be intact, but our cognitive ability has already shifted.
So our default event-based observation is just fundamentally flawed from the very start.
We might need to aggressively shift our mindset to match these operational principles.
How do we practically do that if the gradient is basically totally invisible?
The main objective is correctly identifying which stage of the process we are in.
So we have to actively track the pressure itself, not the final break.
Yes, we must stop observing mere superficial events and strictly observe structural pressure.
We look for the microfractures instead of just waiting for the wood to snap.
This framework exposes these logs to permanently change how we actually see our environment.
It is literally trying to install a completely new operating system in your brain.
Once you understand gradients, you might see a delayed shipment as a vital signal.
You start actively watching how it interacts with the banking sector or the grid.
And tracking that pressure leaves us in a state of continuous, peaceful observation.
You no longer feel completely ambushed when a major institution suddenly falls apart.
You simply realize the system crossed a structural threshold we were not trained to see.
It is empowering, you know? You are not just a victim of random historical events.
You become a structural observer. That is the exact cognitive change required here.
And, well, we are not going to wrap this up with a tidy conclusion today.
The structural pressure in our complex world is always ongoing and continuously shifting.
Look closely at your own immediate daily environment and the systems you rely on.
Deeply consider the physical resources, the capital flows, and your own personal cognition.
Ask yourself, where is a hidden gradient currently masquerading as perfect, rigid stability?
And which layer of our world is quietly approaching the threshold of a phase shift?